Today's story isn't about politics or headlines, it's about legacy, grit, and the quiet power of doing what's right when no one's clapping. If you've ever mentored a kid, fixed something with your own two hands, or believed in someone before they believed in themselves, this one's for you. Join us as we follow Karoline Leavitt back to a forgotten corner of New Hampshire, where an old cassette tape reawakens a truth too powerful to stay buried. Let's begin. Karoline Leavitt had been staring at her speech draft for over 2 hours, the glow of her laptop the only light in the room. Outside her Washington, D.C. apartment, the city slept, but her mind didn't. As the youngest White House press secretary in history, her schedule left little space for reflection or sleep. A cold cup of coffee sat untouched. She rubbed her eyes and leaned back. That's when her personal phone, not her government-issued line, buzzed once. Unknown number. She almost ignored it, but something made her swipe. No words, just a file. Audio. Against every instinct drilled into her by White House protocol, she tapped play. The sound was crackly, like it had been ripped from a dusty cassette player. At first just static, then her own voice, younger, softer, filled with that fire she'd all but forgotten. "We don't need perfect voices to change the world. We need honest ones," teenage Karoline said from across the years, through an old recording of a high school radio segment she hadn't heard in over a decade. Her breath caught. She remembered the room she'd recorded it in. Hard tile floors, a too loud air conditioner, the red light over the mic that flickered like it needed replacing. But she didn't remember this particular tape surviving. And no one else should have had it. Then came a second voice, quiet, older, female. "You don't know me," it said, "but I've been listening, and I think you should come back to Manchester." A brief pause. "There's more than your voice echoing here." Then silence. Karoline sat motionless. That voice, not a stranger's. Familiar in a distant way, like a coat you wore long ago, folded in a box and forgotten until its scent hit you again. She opened the file's metadata. It was anonymized. No location, no sender, no trace, but the message was clear. Someone had preserved her past, and they weren't just holding on to it. They were sending it back. She stood slowly, crossed to the cabinet where she kept a secure backup phone, one of those untraceable models her security chief, Tamara Hayes, insisted on for sensitive detours. Within 5 minutes, she had the burner activated and her usual number powered down. She stared at it for a long second, thumb hovering. She wasn't calling the White House. Not yet. She was calling her own memory. Manchester, New Hampshire. The town she'd worked so hard to leave behind. Her mother still lived there, but Karoline hadn't visited in years. Not since the campaign. Not since Everett Langston smeared her name across local papers and disappeared after losing the race. Now something, or someone, was pulling her back. She walked into her closet, past the tailored jackets and podium-ready dresses, to the back corner. Jeans, hoodie, worn sneakers. The disguise of a person not in power. She dressed quickly. One last glance at her apartment. Tidy, controlled, like everything in her life. 20 minutes later, a gray sedan from the secure pool rolled into the alley behind her building. The driver said nothing, just handed her a file folder from Tamara. Inside, a printed note. "Unknown signals aren't always interference. Trackers are enabled. Be careful." She didn't need careful, she needed answers. The car rolled silently through the sleeping capital, streetlights blurring across the windows. As they passed the Potomac, Karoline's eyes settled on her reflection. Still young, yes, but different from the girl in the tape. That girl wanted to change the system. This woman worked for it. Maybe that was the point. Maybe the tape had been sent, not as a warning, but as a reminder. And somewhere up north, in a hollowed-out textile mill near the Merrimack River, someone still believed in the voice of a high school kid who dared to speak into static and expect an answer. By the time Karoline reached Manchester, the morning sun had just begun to cut through the fog that settled over the Merrimack River. The streets were still slick from last night's rain, the kind of gray New England morning that smelled like cold metal and old pavement. The city hadn't changed much, not really. New facades, more traffic, yes, but the bones were the same. brick buildings with history in their cracks, corner diners still blinking open in neon, and the mill, still there, but different. The car stopped at an address printed on a plain envelope she'd found tucked under her car seat. The Signal Mill, it said. Just that. No logo, no explanation. The building looked like something out of another life. Red brick worn to a dull rust, big arched windows blacked out with curtains, and an old wooden door with a brass plate polished by years of handprints. She stepped out and adjusted her hoodie. To any passerby, she was just another traveler returning to a town that hadn't missed her. That was the idea. The door creaked open before she knocked. A young woman stood in the doorway, late 20s maybe, wavy hair pulled back, sharp glasses, steady posture. "You came," she said, as if it had been inevitable. She didn't introduce herself, just stepped aside and let Karoline in. The inside of the building was unexpected. The walls were lined with soundproofing foam, shelves of donated equipment, cabinets marked archival reels and student masters. A makeshift studio with analog mics and modern rigs stood in the center. Every inch had the feel of something built by hand, not funding. The woman led her through the main hall, her voice soft but clear. "I'm Nora Callahan." She paused near a display case holding a cracked microphone, a dusty plaque underneath, "For those who never got to speak until now." "My mother," she continued, "was Irene Callahan. She taught at Washington Street High, English mostly, but more than that. She was the kind of teacher who stayed late, cleaned her own classroom, paid for paper and supplies when budgets didn't care." The name hit Karoline like a slow echo. Irene Callahan. She remembered her, but faintly. The kind of teacher who didn't demand attention, didn't shout, didn't crowd students, just observed, asked the right question at the right time. "She used to linger outside the school radio room," Nora said, as if reading her thoughts. "You never noticed her, but she heard everything." "You didn't see her, but she saw you." Karoline followed Nora into a small side room. It looked like a break room and archive had merged, kettle, teacups, and a wall of labeled boxes. Nora pulled down a tin box and handed it over. This was hers. "And yours." Inside were index cards, faded lesson plans, and tapes, dozens of them, most labeled in careful handwriting. A few, just initials. One simply said, CL, drive tape. "She kept your broadcasts," Nora said, sitting down. "Every one. She said your voice was raw but real. You were angry but honest. She believed in you before you did." Karoline didn't speak, just stared at the box in her lap. Inside was the sound of someone believing in her when she wasn't even sure she belonged. "Why didn't she tell me?" she asked, more to herself than to Nora. "She wanted to," Nora said, "but then you left. Politics, campaigns, speeches. She figured you'd forgotten, and she was never the type to interrupt someone's rise." Karoline set the box down. "And what is this place?" she asked finally, eyes scanning the makeshift studios and handwritten signs. Nora smiled, not with pride, but something deeper. "This is the Signal Mill. She built it. Started with a few kids who couldn't stay in regular school, too anxious, too odd, too lost. She taught them how to tell stories. On tape, on air, with their own voices." The concept was simple, but the execution was profound. Karoline could feel it. The walls breathed with intentionality. This wasn't a charity. It was a philosophy. A belief that everyone deserved to be heard, even if they had to learn how to speak in a language only they understood. Nora stood, walked to a cabinet and unlocked it. She pulled out a small object, a dictaphone. "She left a message," she said. "For you." Karoline pressed play. "I always believed voices weren't lost. They were just waiting for the right room to echo in," Irene said. "And Karoline, you were the room. You just didn't know it. You lit the match, and I built the fire. Now it's your turn again." Karoline closed her eyes. That voice, patient, measured, certain, wasn't calling her back to the past. It was pulling her towards something new. She opened her eyes, looked at Nora. "I'm listening," she said. The first time Karoline really saw the Signal Mill was not when she stepped through its doors, but when she stood in its bones. After Nora's quiet invitation, they passed through a wide hallway flanked by exposed brick and old pipes snaking along the ceiling like veins. The hum of activity grew louder. Low voices, bits of laughter, the unmistakable click of analog audio equipment. Then the hallway opened up into a wide central floor, once used for spooling thread and dyeing textile. Now it breathed with new life. Cables strung across rafters, mismatched furniture, corkboards pinned with scribbled ideas, and podcast storyboards. No polish, no grants, just grit. "We don't run classes," Nora explained as they walked. "We give them tools, they tell their stories. That's the model." Near one wall, a teenager was hunched over a mixing board, headphones half off, adjusting EQ levels on a local interview. Next to him, a girl was recording narration into a microphone mounted on a wooden stand, likely built by hand. Further along, a group was editing video on ancient desktop rigs, the kind that hummed loud enough to vibrate the floor slightly. Karoline's eyes scanned everything: duct-taped mic stands, plastic bins labeled guest gear, rolls of gaffer tape, and index cards scrawled with segment timing. "We train them in voice," Nora said, "but not just how to speak. We train them how to find out what's worth saying. Then we teach them how to say it with precision, not polish." Karoline noticed a sign over the doorway to the editing suite. "Clear over clever." "They write everything themselves?" Karoline asked. "They have to," Nora said. "Nobody writes the story of your life better than you do, but they learn the craft, structure, pacing, sound design." Irene was old school. She believed in standards, not scripts. There was no branding, no polished logos. The furniture was mostly donated. The paint was chipped, but the work? It was serious, and it was personal. She paused at a wall lined with framed photos. No professional headshots, just snapshots. Kids sitting at mics, group photos in mismatched hoodies, a few grainy Polaroids with scribbled messages on the frame edges. "First time I didn't stutter. They told me I couldn't, so I did. This room saved my life." "Who funds this?" Karoline asked, genuinely curious. Nora hesitated. "Used to be city grants, some community donations, but now it's barely holding on. We charge what families can afford. Most pay nothing, some chip in with elbow grease. This couch," she patted a faded green love seat, "was cleaned by a kid's dad who used to drive trucks. And it all started with tapes I left in a high school radio room." Nora nodded. "Irene used to say you were proof that someone rough-edged and unpolished could still get heard if they kept speaking. She played your tapes for the first group, not because they were perfect, because they were honest." Karoline said nothing, but her face shifted, a mixture of humility and discomfort. She'd made a career out of controlling the narrative. Here, they were building something out of the raw truth. They moved through more rooms, a small tech bay stacked with reel-to-reel players and refurbished mixers, a tiny soundproof booth with foam scavenged from a shuttered studio, a soft-lit room with beanbags and heavy curtains labeled "Quiet Edit Zone." The place was a cathedral of cobbled-together care. Nora led her to the back stairwell, pointing upward. "We have one more space you should see." Up a narrow flight of stairs, they reached the rooftop, technically still part of the old building. The sun had risen fully now, and the town stretched before them in quiet lines. Smokestacks from dormant mills, church spires, rusted water towers. On the roof, a small greenhouse sat in one corner, beside an array of folding chairs and a whiteboard covered in handwriting. "Irene called it the quiet deck," Nora said. "It's where the students come when the noise inside gets too much, where we remind them it's okay to slow down before speaking up." Karoline stood at the edge, wind catching the edge of her coat. The signal mill wasn't built on money or marketing. It was built the way real change is, slow, unseen, brick by brick, voice by voice. She turned to Nora. "I need to know everything. Budgets, staff, who's at risk. I don't just want to understand the place, I want to know what's standing in its way." Nora didn't nod. She didn't smile. She just said the words that mattered. "Then you're in." Karoline didn't need the name. The moment Nora slid the file across the studio table, thick manila envelope, real paper, not digital, she knew who was behind it. Inside were zoning petitions, property assessments, and a memo from Red Ridge Holdings proposing expedited acquisition of 3 Manchester parcels. One name was circled in red ink, the Signal Mill, and at the top of the boardroom minutes stamped in clean serif font, Everett Langston, CEO. She exhaled slowly. Of course it was him. Langston wasn't just a rival. He was the one political opponent who'd made things personal. Years ago, he'd lost a congressional race to Karoline by a narrow margin, blaming the press coverage she'd masterfully controlled and the loyalty she'd stirred in blue-collar New Hampshire voters. He'd vanished after that defeat, pivoting to real estate, hedge-backed development, and, as it turned out, long memories. He hadn't forgotten the public loss, and he certainly hadn't forgotten her. He's been buying up property around the mill for 2 years, Nora explained, her voice flat. Community health clinic, auto co-op, the boxing gym down the block, all gone. Now he's gunning for us. Karoline flipped through the documents. Every page smelled like strategic erasure, not random acquisitions, targeted removals. And you think this is personal? She asked, though the question felt hollow. Nora shrugged. We didn't. Until this. She handed Karoline a copy of an email. The header was a company server. The content was short and chilling. Sullivan property equals priority target. Fast track legal review. No delays. Discreet transfer recommended. Karoline's jaw set. Sullivan property. Irene's full name was Irene Sullivan Callahan. She'd bought the building under her maiden name, likely never thinking it would one day be a red dot on a political hit list. He thinks if he tears down the building, he erases what grew from it, Karoline muttered. She stood and paced the edge of the studio, the old wooden floorboards creaking under her boots. Langston was smart. Vengeful, yes, but meticulous. He wouldn't come at her in the press, not yet. He'd let a bulldozer speak instead, let red tape and zoning boards do the slow work of vengeance. No headlines, just demolition. Nora spoke again, this time cautiously. There's something else. My mom, she was there. The night you and Langston had that final argument in the debate prep hall. She was cleaning. She heard what he said. Karoline turned sharply. What did he say? Nora hesitated. He said he'd spend the rest of his career dismantling anything you built, brick by brick, legacy by legacy. Said he'd outlast your fame, and when no one remembered you, he'd still be building. A long silence settled in the room. Karoline felt something cold run through her. Fury, sure, but also something deeper. Legacy wasn't just about what you built. It was about who was willing to destroy it. He thinks this place is a loose thread, she said finally. He pulls it, I unravel. Nora nodded. That's what we're afraid of. Karoline sat back down and studied the paperwork again. Development plans, conversion schematics, public meeting notices buried in holiday schedules, all perfectly legal, all entirely corrupt. This isn't about money, she said. This is about silence. They both understood the stakes now. Langston wasn't targeting property, he was targeting narrative. He wanted to erase the proof that Karoline's influence had reached deeper than speeches and photo ops. He wanted to bury the building that bore witness to her past, where her words had shaped not policy but people. Later that afternoon, Karoline called her security chief. I want full background on Everett Langston's holdings in New Hampshire, any political ties, back-channel donations, start with Redridge, and keep it quiet. She ended the call and turned to Nora. This is no longer about saving a building. This is about protecting a memory. And what do we do? Nora asked. Karoline looked out the wide mill windows at the rooftops of the town she'd once left behind. We tell the truth, she said. Publicly. Loudly. In a way he can't bulldoze. Nora raised an eyebrow. No, I'm thinking a stage. They waited until dusk. Something about the light filtering through the stained mill windows, soft, amber, almost reverent, made it feel right. Nora brought out the box like it was an urn, not fragile, but sacred. A heavy, rectangular steel cassette archive case, dented at the corners, its latch worn smooth from time. She called it the vault, Nora said, setting it down gently on the studio table. Didn't trust clouds, or drives, said legacies belonged in your hands, not your passwords. Karoline opened it slowly, and what she saw took the air out of her lungs. Inside, stacked with almost military precision, were over a dozen labeled tapes. Reel-to-reel, cassette, micro, each tagged in Irene Callahan's faded cursive, and beneath them a thick bundle of envelopes wrapped in a blue ribbon. A flash of memory struck her. Campaign mailers bundled like that, handwritten letters from her father wrapped the same way in her childhood home. Except these weren't fan mail, these were reminders. Nora slid a small player across the table. Press play on this one. It's the only tape she ever recorded for you directly. She didn't want me to hear it. Said it wasn't my story. Karoline picked up the cassette marked simply for CL and loaded it. There was a click, then hiss. Then a voice that knocked the wind from her. I'm not sure where this tape finds you, Irene began. Her voice older than Karoline remembered, but still unmistakably hers. Maybe you're still chasing firestorms in DC, or maybe you've already forgotten me. Doesn't matter. What matters is that I remember you. Not the press secretary, the girl who stayed late in the radio room after everyone went home, trying to fix a broken mic and still speak her truth. Karoline swallowed hard. I used to sweep the hallway outside that room, Irene continued. You never noticed. And I never interrupted, but I listened. You were too loud to ignore, too raw, too honest. That's when I started taping your segments. Not for blackmail, she chuckled. For belief. I wanted to build something that could hold voices like yours, voices that trembled but stood firm. So I did. The tape crackled again. The signal mill came from that spark. You lit it, I just carried it. I didn't tell you because I didn't want thanks. I wanted proof it mattered. You became that proof. Karoline hit pause. Her hand trembled, but her face held still. There's more, Nora said, gently. But I think you should read this next. She handed her the ribbon-tied bundle of letters. The first envelope was yellowed at the corners, labeled in the same handwriting, to the girl who didn't quit. Karoline untied the ribbon and opened it. You didn't know it, but you were teaching me too. I'd given up on my old dreams, journalism, broadcasting. Life got in the way. Bills, jobs, being a single mom. But when I heard you fight to run that radio show, fight through chaos, failure, and dead air, I remembered why I ever cared about the truth in the first place. The letters spanned years, some short, barely a paragraph, others several pages long, recounting her struggles building the signal mill, finding donors, fixing plumbing herself, learning to solder audio gear from YouTube just to keep kids' podcasts alive. Karoline read them slowly, as if each word deserved a moment of silence. One letter hit harder than the rest. When I got the cancer diagnosis, I didn't cry. I sat in the mill alone that night, played one of your old tapes, and thought, this is enough. If I go soon, I go knowing I passed the signal on. By the time Karoline reached the final letter, her hands were steady again, but her eyes were rimmed red. They'll try to bulldoze this place, you know. Maybe not tomorrow, maybe not next month, but one day, someone will see it not as a haven, but as square footage. If that day comes, I hope you remember what we built here wasn't just a center. It was a rebuttal. To silence. To conformity. To forgetting. Nora stayed quiet. She didn't need to speak. She had grown up in these pages. Karoline looked at her and asked only one thing. Why now? Nora's voice was calm. Because she waited. For the moment you'd need to hear it. Not just to remember her, but to remember you. They sat together in silence for a while longer, the hiss of old tape loops filling the air. Outside, the lights across the mill courtyard flickered on. Inside, Karoline held the ribbon and the tape recorder in her lap. Not symbols of loss, but of inheritance. Not of a legacy left behind, but one handed forward. Karoline had read about visionaries in policy briefings, men in suits with pitch decks and foundations. But Irene Callahan didn't fit that mold. She built the signal mill not with capital, but with calluses. Nora walked her through it that evening, not as a grand tour, but as a ledger of sweat. Irene started with nothing but her pension, a severance check from the district after they cut her position, and a small inheritance from a sister she barely knew. That barely covered a few months of rent for a condemned portion of the old textile mill. The rest, Nora said, flipping open a tattered red ledger, she earned it, floor by floor. Irene worked nights at a diner on Route 3, filling orders after school hours. Weekends, she cleaned offices, and for 2 years she took no vacations. Every dollar she didn't spend on food or Nora's braces went into salvaging this building. She stripped moldy drywall herself, learned wiring from a retired electrician down the block, and bartered English tutoring for second-hand AV gear. When she couldn't afford real insulation, she scavenged theater soundproofing from a shuttered performance hall. Nothing matched, but everything worked. She used to say, Nora recalled, that if you couldn't build it with your hands, it wasn't really yours. Karoline stood in one corner of the original classroom, where the concrete still showed through beneath the rugs. She didn't do this for recognition, she said. No, Nora said quietly. She did it because no one else would. The kids who came to the signal mill weren't star students. They weren't program darlings. They were the ones falling through cracks in the system, anxious, overlooked, labeled as disruptive or behind. Irene didn't see them as broken. She saw them as misunderstood signals, static, waiting to be tuned. She taught them how to script, record, edit, and publish. But more than that, she taught them how to build things that work, from content to character. When the grants dried up, Nora continued, we didn't close. We fixed chairs with zip ties. We used garage sale mics. One kid edited an award-winning piece using a laptop with no E key. Karoline ran her hand along the frame of a DIY sound booth. The seams weren't clean. The cuts weren't measured. But it held. Just like everything else here. The blueprint Irene followed wasn't written on blue paper. It was drawn in acts of daily resilience, in working overtime so a kid could get a second-hand camcorder, in sacrificing comfort so someone else could find their voice. She never called it a center, Nora added. She called it a workbench, a place where people learned by doing. Karoline looked down at her hands, still soft from years of staff buffers and press conference podiums. She realized then that she'd spent so long crafting messages for others that she'd forgotten what it felt like to build something that couldn't be spun. Irene hadn't just mentored her. She'd built a lighthouse using the dim glow of Karoline's earliest ambition. Not for show, but to guide others quietly through their own dark. And now, it stood at risk, not because it failed, but because it succeeded in silence. The kind of success no one tracks on spreadsheets, the kind that only those who understand what it costs to build with nothing can truly appreciate. Karoline looked up, voice low but firm. Not one brick of this gets bulldozed. They packed the old firehouse that night, folding chairs creaking under the weight of veterans, tradesmen, local shopkeepers, and retired city workers. Some wore jackets from the local steel union. Others came straight from shift at the paper plant. The sign on the makeshift podium read, Zoning and Public Use Hearing, Block 4 Development Proposal. But everyone in the room knew what this was really about. Red Ridge Holdings versus the Signal Mill. And as Karoline stepped into the room, flanked not by aides but by memory, the air tightened. Some recognized her. Others whispered. The youngest White House press secretary, returning home without cameras or entourage, just steel in her eyes and something worth protecting. Nora stood in the back, a quiet sentinel. June Whitlow sat near the front, hands clasped like a farmer in church. Karoline climbed to the microphone, paper in hand, but she didn't look down once. I was 16 the first time I tried to speak into a microphone, she began. It was in a broken-down radio booth in a school that had forgotten what it meant to listen. My hands were shaking, my voice cracked. But I said something I meant. If we don't make room for the quiet voices, we'll never hear the truth at all. A pause, no filler, just wait. And someone heard me, not a politician, not a donor, a janitor, a part-time teacher with no pension and a full heart. Her name was Irene Callahan. You didn't read about her, she didn't go viral, but she built something in this town that most people with degrees and budgets couldn't. A space where kids who didn't belong anywhere else could find the power of their own voice. She called it The signal mill. Murmurs of recognition rippled. Karoline pressed on. She didn't do it with grants, she did it with elbow grease and borrowed tools. She patched holes with her own hands, mentored kids after her third shift, and when the world said no one cares, she said, then we build it ourselves. She glanced at the back, where Everett Langston stood against the wall in a tailored suit, arms crossed, watching. And now someone wants to bulldoze it. Not to fix what's broken, but to profit from what's quietly working. The room stilled. Redridge Holdings, run by Everett Langston, has filed for acquisition of that property. He calls it a blight, I call it a blueprint. A place that raised kids this town didn't know how to save. Kids who went on to become editors, broadcasters, first-time college graduates. And it didn't happen because of policy. It happened because one woman with no power believed that purpose could still be built with bare hands. Karoline stepped from the mic briefly, holding up a worn-out tape cassette. This tape was recorded by Irene. She made it in case this day ever came. It says, "If they try to erase the signal, you be the static, you stay on air. I intend to do exactly that." Gasps. A few tears. Someone clapped slowly. Then a flood of applause. She turned to Langston. "Didn't flinch. You tried to erase my past because you couldn't compete with it. But this isn't about me anymore. This is about a town that still remembers what real integrity looks like, and about a building that proves not all legacies wear name tags or sit on foundations. They sit in hearts, on hard chairs, with kids learning how to speak." Langston's face tightened, but he said nothing. There was no comeback for the truth when it hit that hard. Karoline looked out over the room. "I'm calling for emergency preservation of the signal mill under the Community Legacy Act. I've filed a federal injunction to delay Redridge's acquisition, and I'm submitting a proposal to launch the Voices of Tomorrow initiative, national funding for centers like this, starting right here." The place erupted. In that moment, she wasn't a press secretary. She wasn't a political operative. She was a daughter of Manchester's standing where her voice first cracked. And this time, it didn't. 6 months later, the building still stood. Not because of headlines or hashtags, but because the people inside had made it matter. The signal mill wasn't polished or pristine, but it had been repaired where it needed to be, rewired with care, and repainted just enough to look like someone believed in it again. The front entrance now bore a small bronze plaque, "The Irene Callahan Center for Voice and Storycraft." Below it, etched in simple font, "Built with hands, preserved by hearts." Karoline stood beneath it that morning in a worn green coat, not as a guest, not as a politician, but as someone returning to a place that had quietly saved her, even when she didn't know it. She didn't come alone. Veterans from the preservation vote were there, teachers from nearby districts, a few skeptical city planners who'd voted no the first time, then changed their minds when they saw the kids' work. A crowd had gathered in the courtyard. Folding chairs were set up around the garden Irene once called the quiet deck. Teens in hoodies shared stories about the first time they touched a soundboard, wrote a monologue, built a story from silence. One boy read a piece about his dad's job loss and how it made him scared to speak until the signal mill gave him a way to process it through a podcast. A girl presented her short film about being the only deaf student in her school and how the mill taught her how to subtitle her own truth. No one looked away. No one checked their phones. Then Nora stepped forward, smiling but misty-eyed. "My mother never asked to be remembered. She asked for the work to live on. Today, thanks to all of you, and especially Karoline, that's exactly what's happening." She nodded to the side of the courtyard where a second plaque had been unveiled. It bore just one name, Karoline Leavitt, the first voice. The crowd applauded, and for a moment, Karoline said nothing. She walked slowly to the podium under the old oak tree, hands folded around a yellowed tape in a plastic case. "I carried this with me for over a decade," she began. "It's a piece of audio advice I once thought came from an old friend. I didn't know it came from Irene. I didn't know it came from a woman who believed in me when I was young and angry and unsure. But what I do know is this. Her faith built this place, and now we're going to build more." She looked around the garden. Today, I'm proud to announce that the Signal Mill is now the national flagship site of the Voices of Tomorrow initiative, a federally backed network of centers like this one, focused on teaching storytelling to kids who don't fit the mold, who've been overlooked by systems built for sameness. There were nods, murmurs, more than a few tears. Because the truth is, she said, we don't need more scripted speeches, we need more real ones, from garages, from broken homes, from classrooms no one funds anymore. We need the voices of kids whose stories don't come with sponsors. Behind her, a new studio sign lit up, not flashy, just letters carved by hand, backlit with soft yellow, Studio Irene. Beneath it, students were setting up for the day's recording. No balloons, no ceremony, just kids getting to work. Karoline smiled, turned back to the crowd. Let this place be our answer to silence, she said. Let it be proof that something real still grows in the cracks. And then she stepped down, not to applause, but to the sound of a mic testing in the distance, the hiss of static, then a young voice, nervous, unsteady, but ready to speak, and for once, the world listened. The story of the Signal Mill reminds us that true legacy isn't built in press rooms or polished speeches. It's built in quiet moments, in overlooked classrooms and with bare hands. At its core, the lesson is clear. Real impact often comes from people who never ask for recognition. Irene Callahan didn't have funding, fame, or a platform. What she had was belief in her students, in the power of story, and in a young girl's shaky radio voice that carried more truth than perfection. That belief grew into a haven that outlived her. For those who've worked with their hands, raised families, mentored quietly, or stood their ground without spotlight, this story is proof that the small, consistent acts of guidance and grit matter more than grand gestures. It also reminds us that protecting community means protecting the people and places that shaped us, even when no one else sees their value. Most importantly, it shows that a single voice, remembered and honored, can echo into the future and carry others forward. Legacy isn't just what we leave behind, it's what we keep alive in others, especially when we help them find a voice no one else thought they had.